Welcome everyone to this first virtual digital economy seminar of the spring semester 2021. It's a great pleasure to see all of you again and to start the schedule with an outstanding speaker. The moderator today will be Hannes Ulrich at DIW Berlin and the University of Copenhagen. The format will be as usual. If you have any clarifying questions during the talk, please send them to Hannes in the chat. He will unmute you so you can ask the question directly. And we'll also use the same channel to collect questions for the Q&A after the talk. The session will be recorded and we will make it available on YouTube. So if you do ask a question, you will appear in the recording. Without further ado, very happy to hand over to Hannes, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Christian. So I'm super happy to welcome today's guest. Pinar Yildirim is Assistant Professor of Marketing at Wharton. Her main research areas are technology, media, and information economics, in which she focuses on questions related to online platforms, advertising, networks, media, and politics. So all topics and research that fits perfectly in our seminar series. So we're very, very happy to have you. Today, Pinar will talk about strategic automation and decision-making authority, joint work with Mustafa Dogan and Alexandre Jacquillat. And Pinar, you have 45 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Hannes, and thank you, Christian. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to present. Additionally happy because it's actually, I'm in Philadelphia right now, and in the East Coast of the United States, we have a snowstorm. Daycares are closed, the schools are closed, and I have 2 small kids at home. So I just want to give the warning, we might have some technology issues, hopefully not, and my kids might Zoom bomb us. So, if it gets a little boring, just let me know and I'll snap my fingers and hopefully my kids will come to entertain the audience. As Hannes mentioned, I am an assistant professor at Wharton. My areas are digital economy. If this is the first time you are seeing my work, my research, my presentation, I do work both on empirical topics as well as theoretical topics. And these days, I just happen to be working on this particular paper. So I thought this would be a great time to present it, to get a little bit of your questions and feedback, to see how you like it. And that's why I chose to present this. This is going to be a work, not perhaps surprisingly to this audience, on automation and technology. And it's going to focus more on the strategic aspects of automation. I'll tell you what that means. It's joint work with 2 of my wonderful co-authors, Mustafa Dogan and Alexandre Jacquillat, who are at MIT. And let's dive right in if there are no questions. So to this audience, as I mentioned, I don't need to motivate the importance of automation. Normally, in any other conversation, I would be speaking about why automation is so relevant and why we need to think about questions related to automation these days. But given the scope and scale at which this technology is applied to different industries and is changing the scope of work, we need to be now thinking about questions related to firm at a more maybe strategic level. And that was the motivation or the starting point to us. There are a lot of works on automation. I'll refer to a few of them as well. But this is a good time to be asking bigger questions related to the effects of automation. And it's also a good time to maybe revisit some of the questions that we've been familiar for a long time in the literature that is focusing on technology. So that's the starting point for us. And we think of the effects of automation in general happening along a number of different dimensions, right? There's of course, the immediate effects of automation. That is, for instance, the effect on wages and employment. There is work on the reallocation of labor from one type of task to another type of task. There are even works on the migration effects, geographical migration effects of automation. And there are works, of course, on different skills, low skill, high skill works and tasks, and how likely they are to be affected by automation. But there are fairly few number of works on the organizational structure, how automation affects the overall organization and the way that the organization functions, as well as adoption of automation. There's, for instance, there's the work by Effie and Joshua Gans et al., which also talks about an issue, but we are going to go a little deeper, richer into this topic. We'll think of the communication between agents. We'll think of how effectively to allocate automation within an organization. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this, of course, when we think of these 2 interactions, we will be focusing on questions related to organization. Let's go into the research questions in specific. So what are the things that we are going to think about within this research? We are going to, first of all, overall, ask this question about the impact of automation, right? What's the impact of automation within the organization with respect to the decision-making structure? Is there an effect? And if there is an effect, is this effect somehow strategic? What are the benefits of realigning an organization through automation, giving different decision-making authority to different agents? We'll think along these lines. And then when we are, of course, asking these questions, we can also answer more micro-level questions about how to allocate an investment and overall capacity of automation or technology within the divisions of the firm. We'll have asymmetric divisions. We'll think of the differences across divisions and which one of these divisions you may want to automate under different conditions. So we'll ask these questions at a high level. Of course, at this point, and feel free to interrupt me at any time when you have questions. Of course, at this point, there might come a natural question about what automation exactly means, right? Automation is a very broad umbrella that is typically described for a number of different technologies. The way that we are going to think about automation will be quite simple. We'll stick with the definition that's been given in the literature, that is the machine execution of a task that was previously or could be carried out by a human. So this is a very simple description that simply says a task was carried out by humans and now they can be carried out by a machine or by some kind of software. But the two defining characteristics of automation that we'll focus on are going to be the following. First, as highlighted by the International Society of Automation, which is an organization dedicated to understand and study the effects of automation. First, we'll focus on the operational efficiency effect of automation, and that is simply increasing the efficiency with which a task is carried out. This could be done by reduction of the time in which the task is carried out, or reducing the waste, or reducing the costs that are associated with the particular task. We'll think about the operational efficiency, and more importantly, we'll focus on a second piece, which has received a lot less attention in the literature, and that's going to be the consistency with which a task is carried out. And more specifically in the terminology, it's going to be the reduction of variability in the operational characteristics of the task. So we'll be thinking of automation or the technologies that we define as automation along these two dimensions. It doesn't have to be a machine. It doesn't have to be necessarily a software. Any technology effectively that actually satisfies these two dimensions could be used in our framework. You also might be paying attention to this definition that simply defines automation as labor displacing. In fact, in our framework, we don't need to rely on labor displacing technologies. It could be another technology that's complementing the tasks, the labor force, as long as it does satisfy these two conditions, as long as it increases the efficiency, and as long as it actually reduces the variability. We can also think of the complementary technologies to human labor. Okay. And in case you need to leave in 10 minutes, what are the findings that we have? So we're going to argue overall that automation can provide an additional degrees of freedom to the executives to manage firm conflict. And we think that this is actually an important and interesting finding that helps us to think of automation from a very different perspective. It's also a perspective that can be taken to data that actually provides us some empirically testable hypotheses. In specific, we'll think of automation as a strategic tool that's carried out for one of the two objectives, either to reduce the reliance of a principal on the private information of the subordinates, the managers within the organization, so to reduce the negative effects related to asymmetric information, or to reduce the negative effects of biased decision-making. Again, I'll define exactly what these means, but there are two particular objectives or two particular outcomes that you can attain by using automation strategically. So that's the focus of our paper.
Pinar?
And finally, yes.
Larry White has a question.
Just to help me fix ideas, I'm trying to fit your definition of automation. It feels like it is narrower than just substituting capital for labor, that there is a greater restrictiveness to your definition of automation. I mean, should I be thinking about 19th century replacement of human weaving with machine weaving as part of automation, or can you help a little bit with some examples?
Yes, I don't want to narrow the scope of our work or our findings to the examples of automation that we see today that are a lot more high technology. I think that the effects that we are observing might have been occurring over a longer period of time as technology has been strategically used, or as the scope of the technology allowed to obtain these two dimensions. Could we say, for instance, that the variability aspect was there for computers, that it actually allowed us to carry out tasks more consistently? I don't know if I can answer this question as a researcher. I think that there might have been still a fair bit of inconsistency or a fair bit of variability in the work that has remained. But to the extent that other technologies that before our time have attained these two objectives, I think our findings should still be relevant. I hope this is useful, but we can discuss this maybe at the end a little more. This definition of automation technology is something that is, I have to say that there doesn't seem to be a consensus. We try to stick with the definitions of the existing industrial organizations as well as the literature, but even within the literature and even within practice, there seems to be lots of variations in this definition. And that's something that we can discuss later. Just going back to the preview of findings, again, for us, the two outcomes are important, but in addition to that, when we think of automation scope or scale growing, if we think that automation is eventually going to be even more common because of for instance, the reduction in the cost of attaining this technology, then what should we expect in terms of the organizational decision-making structure? What we are going to suggest is that the structure will be a lot more centralized. That is, the power of decision-making will be actually collected at the top, reinforced at the top of an organization, rather than a more democratized structure where people at the mid-levels, mid-managers have decision-making power. So more centralization as opposed to decentralization. And this prediction is actually opposite to some of the existing predictions in the literature. If there are no more questions, let me actually dive into how we get to these results. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the model. And the way that I'm going to do that, I'm going to broadly open up by thinking about organizations, or how we, in a very stylized model, think about the organization, how we model that. There are going to be elements of asymmetric information, conflict, a cheap talk framework that I will, in order to not go too technical to reduce the details. Then I will go into some predictions, some findings related to this model. Okay. The way that we think about organizations is actually going to be very similar to the framework that was used in Alonso et al. 2008, as well as Rantakari's 2008 paper. We'll think of an organization as essentially a firm that's trying to adapt to its outside informational environment. There are some changing conditions, and the firm is trying to understand to what extent it should adapt to these organizational changes. But of course, to be able to make such a decision, the decision makers within the organization do not always have information that's most relevant to those conditions. Sometimes this information is distributed within the firm, and as a result, there has to be some communication between the agents and some decision about who should be making decisions related to the firm, so that the best adaptation or continuity strategy can be implemented ultimately. So we're talking about distributed information within the organization, and let me try to make this a little more concrete by giving an example. Now, consider, for instance, the decision of creating a next generation product. Right? This next generation product, such as the next generation of the iPhone, could be very different from its current design aspects, or it could be very similar to its current design aspects. This is a decision that affects multiple divisions of the organization. So if Apple has to make this decision, it knows that its engineering division will be affected, its marketing division will be affected, its product design divisions will be affected. And this is a decision that's usually made at the top, right? It's not something that someone who's a fairly low-level manager makes a decision about. So that high-level manager needs to make that right decision. What's the right decision? This manager, typically who's a generalist, who may not necessarily be an engineering expert or a product design expert or a marketing expert, needs to make this decision by getting information from the lower level managers who have domain-specific information. For instance, in this case, let's assume there's some kind of conflict between the management engineering division and the marketing division. The marketing division thinks that there are new features, new aspects of a phone that are demanded by the consumers, and this division wants a change. So this division wants adaptation to the new conditions. Whereas the engineering division likes the idea of not having too many changes because that keeps costs low, that makes their division look better. They can produce things at a fairly consistent level. So this division prefers the opposite, sticking with a design that's similar to the existing design. So in that case, they prefer a continuation strategy, a continuity strategy. Now, the high-level manager has to balance these two information and make a decision about how different the design of the product has to be from a previous design. This is the context that we're thinking about, where there is a decision maker who's at the top, who's not necessarily as informed or who's less informed compared to the subordinates. And the subordinates, of course, they think about their own divisions primarily, right? There's a priority. If I'm the mid-level manager who's in charge of the engineering division, I want the engineering division to do well. I might want the marketing division to do well as well, but my priority lies with my own division. So this conflict, as well as the asymmetric information, is the base of our model. Now, how do we go into the model? Essentially, we think of a three-layer organization. There's a principal, again, this generalist who is not necessarily very well informed about of the marketplace. Our managers who are under the principal. To make this simple, we'll actually think of two divisions and we'll actually focus on really one division. You will see that in a second. The managers are running divisions and they have domain-specific expertise. If the principal makes a decision, they can provide some information, some communication, cheap talk communication to the principal. And then, of course, at the bottom layer, there are workers. These people are carrying out tasks and they will be, for the most part, modeled in a very reduced form way. Again, we think of the organizational structure. And in this context, we'll just define centralization and decentralization as the following. When we think of centralization, that's going to be the principal making that decision about the product design, that firm level decision. When we think of decentralization, it's going to be the mid-level manager making that decision. And the principal is going to decide on this organizational structure. And in this context, we'll again model asymmetric information and conflict. How do we do that? So again, we have principal, two divisions. Effectively, even though we have two divisions, we only are going to be focusing on division one, which is the division that is facing changing conditions. The conditions that are facing division zero, manager zero, that is known. And that's going to be defined by a theta zero that takes the value of a constant of zero. Whereas the conditions that are facing division one is actually theta one, and it's unknown. The distribution is essentially between -1 and 1. The distribution is known to the principal, but the actual realization of theta one, the condition that's facing that division, is only going to be observable to the manager. Now, just throughout the presentation, just to make these two a little more clear, I'm going to use the terminology forefront division and business as usual division, right, just to be able to separate these two. And the way we model conflict is going to be simply thinking about the payoff structures of the principal and the manager. And we'll introduce this alpha parameter that is simply the conflict. As you can see, the deviation between the objective functions of the principal and the manager is simply defined by this alpha. The higher alpha is, there's less conflict in the organization because the two objective functions are more aligned. So that's the alpha as well as the theta are the way we capture residual conflict and information asymmetry in an organization. If there's time at the end, I'll talk a lot more about alpha. But in general, most of the results that I'm going to present from now on is actually going to be with respect to alpha. And of course, I'll introduce automation in a second. Now, the divisions that we have here are essentially, can be considered as a collection of tasks, unit tasks, or the unit measure of work that's required to carry out a task. These tasks make identical contributions. Each task can either result on some kind of success or failure, and upon having success, they actually contribute the same value of 1 to the firm. And these tasks can be either operated by a worker or automated. So this is the way that we think about automated versus non-automated tasks. The decision of automating a task will be made by the principal. And what we are going to assume for the benchmark model is that the principal is endowed with some kind of an automation capacity, that's zeta. And simply, she can decide how to allocate it between the two divisions, the forefront division as well as the business as usual division. So that's going to be the key decision. We'll later endogenize the capacity as well, but for now, let's fix that value. So what's the difference between automated and non-automated tasks? In this context, a non-automated task will, or the probability of success of a non-automated task will depend on two things: the productivity of the division that the task is residing in, as well as the effort choice of the workers. In the automated case, though, we'll define simply a technology that determines the probability of success. So you can see that here we are making an extreme assumption in some sense that there is a fixed probability of success once you start to automate a task. That is how we capture variability or reduce variability in our framework. The same qualitative findings should hold even if we didn't model it completely this way by fixing the probability of success in one division, but simply assume that it's reduced relative to a non-automated task. But this is how we are going to capture it. And mathematically speaking, there's a firm level decision D, this is the design decision. It influences both divisions, both engineering as well as marketing divisions' productivity. And the productivity of a division can either be high or low, depending on how accommodating the decision of the principal or the manager is to the conditions that are facing this division. So in this aspect, a continuity strategy is setting this design division closer to theta zero, the ongoing conditions of the business as usual division. And an adaptation strategy is the opposite, setting the firm level decision or the design division close to actually theta 1. That's the realized condition of the forefront division. Any questions at this point? I've been okay.
No, all good.
Okay, all right. So if there are any questions, let me know, because I'll talk a little more math, and that might get a little confusing at some point. But now, once we have the productivity of the divisions that are set up, we can think of how the probability of success or the contribution of an automated versus a non-automated task looks like. Now, for an automated task, as I mentioned earlier, we'll assume a fixed probability of success. That's going to be rho. For a non-automated task, essentially we'll think of two components that affect the probability of success, and that's going to be, again, the productivity of the division, which is determined in part by the decision, the firm level decision that is made, whether the structure is more accommodating or not, and of course the effort of the worker. I'm not going to even talk about the effort of the worker. We just simply assume there's some kind of aligned incentive, an incentive structure that's aligned with the firm, and the workers are simply going to be trying to maximize their payoff, simply the success likelihood, the PIE, with respect to some cost, the quadratic cost. Okay, so how does the game look like? The game under the centralized structure, again, this is the principal making the firm level decision, will look like the following. The principal will start with the decision of automation. The principal is going to allocate the automation capacity to the two divisions. And then there will be a realization of the conditions that are facing the forefront division. And the manager will send a chip talk communication to the principal. Then based on this message, the principal will update his beliefs about the optimal strategy, and she's going to make the decision about the firm level strategy. And productivity will realize in both divisions, workers will make effort choice, and the payoffs will realize. This decentralized structure looks very similar to this. The first two steps are similar. Of course, the optimal allocation of automation will look different. But what seems to be, and the last couple steps are the same, but what's going to be different is what happens in between. Essentially, there's no communication here between the manager and the principal. The principal is making the decision based on the beliefs. And according to that, the productivity of the divisions as well as the worker choice and the payoffs will realize. So that's the key difference. Now, looking at it from a different perspective, yes.
I'm sorry, I'm just relaying a question. I think that was on the previous slide. Why there's a number 2 in the high productivity probability?
I think it's actually a typo there. It should be the square. It should be the square.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
And the previous one also should be the square. Okay, so now the question, of course, let's just look at it from the same, basically the same timeline or the information exchange based on a figure. Now we see the centralized and decentralized structure. What determines the division's productivity is essentially 2 things. That's the decision PI about basically the productivity, the decision of D that affects the productivity PI for the 2 divisions, and the automation allocation structure that also is determined by the principal. That's what's going to affect the ultimate output of the 2 divisions. In one of these, there's an additional communication channel, right? On the centralized structure, there's an additional communication channel where the manager simply informs the principal about the conditions of division 1. And in the other, the centralized structure, there's actually no loop of this kind. So this is going to be in terms of the communication, this is going to be the key difference. Now, just for those who want to see the payoff structure, the profit expressions, just as a mathematical sort of expression here, the difference between centralization and decentralization is going to look like this for essentially the 2. And the profit of the divisions is a combination of the decision of the firm as well as the essentially realized productivity of division 1 and the decisions data about the automation allocation structure. Now, again, these are the key ingredients. Now I'm going to start going into the analysis, the results that come from this model. If there are any questions at this point that I can answer to clarify either the model or in general the insights, let me know. Let me take a pause here. If not, we can go dive right in. Okay, let's do that. So I'm going to basically focus on the solution. So when we solve the game, of course, using backward induction for the optimal firm decision under centralized and decentralized organizational structures, here are the outcomes that we find. The decentralized decision of the firm is going to be a combination of the realized condition, right? This is the manager's decision, as well as some beta that essentially indicates how aligned with these new changing conditions the decision or the adaptation strategy of the firm should be. The decision structure, or at least the formulation for centralized, the principal decision looks very similar, except of course there is an expected condition of the division that is conditional on the reporting by the manager here that we use. In both of these decisions, if you look at the alignment of betas, in both of these cases, the alignment to the changing conditions is less than 1. So the manager or the principal, they're not fully aligning to the changing conditions. But whether one is aligning more than the other, that's going to depend on the characterization of this alpha. Just as a side note here, I am using these deltas. Deltas are simply the difference between the profit levels of particular division under high and low productivity. Let's just use that as a notation for simplification. They're not going to play a significant role here. Now, I'm not going to go into too much details of the equilibrium communication, but when we characterize this communication, not too surprisingly, what we are seeing is that in the state space of -1 to 1, there are infinite many partitions, and these partitions, the information that the manager is giving the principal is becoming coarser and coarser as as you're getting closer to 1 minus 1, as the conditions that the division is facing is changing. Now, what the manager is communicating is simply the interval, right? Let's say minus m minus 1. This interval at which the changing conditions theta 1 is located, and based on that information, the principal is going to update the beliefs. So as you can see, this interval, or the bounds of this interval, is defined by this complicated expression. I don't want you to go into this complicated expression, but the two things that you can take away, it's going to depend on the conflict, and it's going to depend on the automation structure, the automation allocation of the firm. In specific, what we can say, the allocation with regards to automation is slightly more ambiguous, but what we can say is that the communication is going to be more coarse when the conflict is higher, and that should be in line with the intuition. Now, what can we say about the alignment of the decisions of the principal and the manager, right? If we think of the betas, the share of those betas, the relative alignment to the changing conditions of division 1. Now, this again depends on the automation deployment as well as the conflict, but let me show you through a figure how this looks like. So what you're seeing in this figure is essentially how the decisions of the manager, decisions of the principal would look like. The optimal decision of the manager is the blue straight line, right? This manager, if he's in line, he's in charge of decision making, he knows the conditions. So there's a solid line that you can see that changes, that adapts to the conditions that are expressed in the horizontal axis. The optimal decisions of the principal is, of course, this is not a continuous decision, because the principal is only given an interval, and in that interval makes a uniform decision with regards to the decision of the firm. The dashed green line here is the decision of the principal if she had known the conditions perfectly. So the two things that we can highlight is that, of course, both of these, the lines, again, the slopes are less than 1, so they're not fully adapting to the conditions, the changing conditions. But what's sort of interesting is that because of the imperfect information, the principal can, in some cases, be more accommodating and more adapting to the conditions, changing conditions of division 1 than the manager itself. Right? So this is the inefficiency in the system, and this is the inefficiency that the principal is also going to try to resolve. So that's something that's sort of interesting that comes out from this analysis. Now, what can we say? With a higher degree of alignment, of course, the decisions are more similar, but there's also less polarization within the firm in the sense that when you look at the divisions and the decisions that are made with regarding to these divisions, one division is a lot more aligned with the changing conditions, and the other division is not, as a higher degree of alignment simply makes these two divisions more aligned as well in terms of the strategy of the firm. And finally, of course, a larger automation capacity in the forefront division is going to result in lower alignment, and I'll mention the insights for this in a second. Now, in terms of time, I'm also going to just very briefly mention the value of information, but I want to dive into the automation capacity. So we can also think of course, how valuable the manager is to the principal by thinking about the value of information. The calculation for value of information could simply be the difference between the expected profits if the principal had simply like perfect information versus no information. And a large automation capacity that's allocated to the forefront division is going to result in a smaller value of information. So to the extent that you can allocate capacity to this division, right, to the changing condition, the division that's facing changing conditions, you rely less on the manager because the manager has that information. And to the extent automation actually, automation takes care of the reliance or reduces your reliance on the manager, then the value of this manager to you is fairly low. So that's what actually is going to generate the next set of results. Now, if you think of the strategic allocation of automation, if we think of which divisions should be receiving an automation capacity, which divisions, is it the forefront or the business as usual that should be receiving a lot more allocation of the technology that we have in hand, if there is a decentralized, what we're finding in equilibrium is that if there is a decentralized decision making, that is the manager is making the decisions, in that case, you would want to allocate the capacity fully to the business as usual division. So it's a bang solution. And the opposite happens under centralization. So under centralization, you want to allocate the capacity to the forefront division. And the question is, why is this happening? What are the benefits, strategic benefits of this sort of asymmetric allocation under the two decision-making structures? And what are the implications of that for the firm? So let's think about this. So why is it that under a decentralized decision-making structure, the automation is simply geared towards the business as usual division? So under a decentralized structure, the main problem that the principal is facing is that because you have the manager in charge, and because that manager prioritizes his own division, his decisions, his adaptation decisions are going to simply favor his own division and not the other division. So in that case, I know that the decision is biased towards the forefront division, and I have to, as the principal, somehow make the automation decision to protect the remaining division from this negative effects of biased decision making. So I allocate automation capacity there to reduce the negative effects of productivity shocks, and I protect that division. In this case, the automation division is geared towards, again, reducing the negative effects of biased decision making of the manager. Whereas in a centralized structure, I'm the principal. I think of all of the divisions of the firm. So there is no biased decision making in this case. But because I make the decisions, I'm the less informed agent, there's going to be potential negative effects from this less informed decision making. Now, in that case, that less informed decision making might harm the forefront division. In order to reduce those negative effects, I automate the forefront division. So I'm actually allocating more of all of the automation capacity to that division in order to, again, reduce the negative effects or reduce my reliance on the mid-level manager. So use of automation within the organization serves two completely different objectives. In one case, I'm trying to mitigate the negative effects of biased decision making. And when I do that, I have to sort of follow a continuation strategy. I'm allocating more of my technology to the business as usual division. In the opposite case, if the principal is making firm level decisions, now I have to mitigate the negative effects of my reliance or reduce my reliance on the manager. And to be able to do that, I allocate the automation capacity to the forefront division. Now, I know this was quite a lot. So if there are any questions in terms of clarification, let me know. But this is the core of the paper, the two sort of opposite objectives of strategic objectives of automation, and why in some cases, some firms will want to allocate their automation capacity to the divisions that are fairly stable, that are not changing sort of varying conditions, uncertain conditions. In other firms, you might want to allocate most of your technology to a division that's facing uncertain conditions. Now, the insights coming from these, as I mentioned, when we look at this, these are almost empirically testable hypotheses. When we look at firms, we might see a heterogeneity in the way that they use technology. And even if they have access to the exact same technology, and in this case, they haven't made any assumptions about the cost of the technology. So assuming that the technology is accessible and affordable by all, the way that firms can use technology, utilize it within the organization in terms of whether that technology is used mostly in divisions that are facing a lot of changing conditions or divisions that are facing more stable conditions, that can look very different across the firms. And the main reason why that's different is who's making the decisions within the firm. So the organizational structure of the firm ultimately determines the allocation and utilization of the automation capacity within the firm. And if somehow we assume that the forefront division or any division that's facing uncertain conditions also would have to have higher skilled workers or would contain higher skilled tasks, in this case, it would also imply that in some organizations, we should see high skilled tasks as opposed to low skilled tasks being automated first or being automated faster. So that's also a sort of a prediction that is opposite to, or maybe complementing some of the earlier findings with regards to what type of skill tasks would be automated first. We're simply finding that it's not always the case that you would want to go with low skill tasks. You might actually, in some organizations, you might want to go with automation of the high skill tasks first. So that's an important second finding as well. Now, what would be if we, for instance, were to look at the conflict within organizations? Again, the conflict is to what extent can you align the decision making or the objectives of the mid-level manager and the high-level manager? If you look at how, with regards to conflict and the overall automation capacity that a firm has, the decisions of the optimal structure look like. So this is basically, after we solve for the basically allocation of the automation capacity, then going with backward induction, the next thing we would decide is what's the optimal decision-making structure? Would you want to have the principal in charge, or would you want to have the manager in charge? And that depends on the conflict, and that depends on the overall capacity of automation that you have, the overall technology. Of course, in this region, there are three areas that we can partition. If the conflict is very high, right? If in this case, that the decision is going to be fairly biased, the high conflict would be the region, the pink region, where alpha is fairly low. In that case, in order to protect yourself from the negative effects of the decision-making, biased decision-making, you go with centralization. You don't want to even take the risk of decentralizing. The opposite end, that's when the conflict is fairly low. In that case, that the manager is more informed, and the manager can also make a decision that's more in line with you. So in that case, you don't want to think about centralization. You can just let the mid-level manager be in charge of the decision-making. But there's a mid-level region that is the automated sensitive region and automation sensitive region. And in that region, the conflict level as well as the capacity determines whether centralization or decentralization is optimal. Now, when the conflict is fairly low, right, that's alpha is higher, in those cases, you can actually again go for decentralization even if you don't have the automation capacity. But in the opposite area, in that mid region, when alpha is fairly low, in order to be able to go against the negative effects of the biased decision making, you need to have fairly high automation capacity. So when you have that capacity, that automation technology, you actually can go with a centralized decision, because that capacity frees you from the decision making, or the reliance frees you from the reliance on the manager. So that's essentially the idea. Now, let me see how we're doing. Okay, couple minutes, and let me try to wrap up. So endogenous automation capacity, of course, we can also try to think of the automation capacity as an endogenous decision. We do that by assuming that there's some cost tau to adoption of automation. And again, just simply modifying the objective functions that we have. We're simply thinking of the profit maximization, where profit is some function of the automation capacity as well as conflicts, but ultimately there's a cost to this. Now, what we find here, and I think this is another important and interesting finding, is that the principal is eventually going to adopt higher and higher levels of automation if the conflict within the firm is increasing. Let me go to actually this figure. This figure highlights two important things. One is that as conflict within the organization is decreasing, as alpha is getting closer to 1, either in a centralized or decentralized structure, in both of these structures, you actually will need lower levels of automation capacity. So you're not going to need as much of an automation or technology in order to resolve the issues in an organization, because the issues are fairly low. So in that sense, the automation capacity is providing a relief to the manager to be able to resolve issues. And the second thing, here in these figures, what you are seeing is essentially the blue line is centralization, the red line is the optimal automation capacity under the centralization, and we are going to have basically we are going to have the optimal in solid line as opposed to the dashed line. So what you see in both of these situations under centralization or decentralization is actually optimal capacity that's chosen is not necessarily the higher capacity, right? Comparing centralization versus decentralization, you can actually choose a lower automation capacity if the organizational structure is set correctly. So that's going to be the other important thing as well. Okay, and I'm getting a visitor. So this might be a good place to actually stop the insights, collect all of the insights together, and then stop. So the important thing that we are saying here is, again, technology investment for firms can almost be a costly decision if your organizational structure is not correctly set up, and that organizational structure is the primer. And once you have the organizational structure, you might actually cut down on the losses of your the losses because of the high levels of technology investments. Put differently, if you look at the world, if you're looking and seeing some of the firms and you see that they are investing a lot into technology, that may not necessarily be a good indicator. It might actually be an indication of their fairly suboptimal organizational structure. So that's the second finding that we can have. We do a few other things within the paper that actually focuses on the cost of technology. We find that as the cost of technology gets lower, centralization is more optimal. It's actually more preferred. And finally, in the extensions that actually is not currently in the document that I shared, we also think of extension of the contracts that the principal gives to the manager that actually takes into account paying some money to remove the conflict. So in this scenario, we actually are showing that there are two outcomes. One is that you don't always want to remove conflict, but at the same time, even if you choose to remove it, you're not going to remove the whole thing. In that sense, automation becomes a substitute to monetary contracts. That's also something that we show at the end, and I think in that sense it's also important. So let me stop here. This is, there are a couple of the extensions that we thought of, but in general, what I wanted to communicate here is automation is a strategic device, and the way that we think of automation in empirical or theoretical work so far as a device to simply produce efficiency, that might be a very limited view of seeing automation. Automation can actually help to manage conflict within the firm, and it can provide a substitute to monetary contracts to the principal to be able to manage that. So in that sense, this is actually providing us some interesting insights, and I hope that we can have further discussion here. But let me stop and see if there are any questions. Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Pinar. You were very well on time. That's perfect. So we have a little bit of time for questions. I haven't received questions for the Q&A so far, but maybe you all can think a little more. I had a more, and I'm not sure if I'm completely wrong, but I had a question about the intuition of this alpha. So essentially that's in a way, so it could be that, or it's that incentives aren't aligned between the manager or the executive and the managers. Is that, and so,
yes, so this is in, and that's what we were trying to do in the extensions of the model. It's quite possible that in any organization that you are trying to get rid of the conflict, but in reality, that getting rid of that conflict also implies having to pay some extra fee to the mid-level manager, and if it's too costly, you may not want to do that. The conflict that we are thinking of and the conflict that's thought of in the literature is typically a residual conflict that may still remain, even if you're trying to resolve the conflict with some monetary contracts.
Okay, because my question, but that's already the answer. I think my question was whether then automation is in a sense a substitute for more complicated incentive pay schemes, possibly. But if there's always some residual non-alignment, that makes sense.
Yeah, so that's why we thought of basically having this extension, which essentially shows that you don't always want to remove contract, you don't always want to use monetary incentives. And even if you do, you can basically benefit from having automation in place to sort of mitigate the conflict further.
I guess I'll just continue. So I also wondered whether you've thought about what you could do with this empirically. So what here would be measurable? So the degree of centralization, automation, incentives. I mean, some of this could be observable or measurable, but
so I think the overall automation investment of firms should be visible, and how they use it, in which divisions they use it, might also be visible. So to the extent that one can observe a degree of heterogeneity in the way that firms use, maybe additional surveys or other general industry facts could also help to identify whether decision making is reinforced at the top in these organizations, or whether it's actually more distributed within an organization. So I think for empirical testing, what might be interesting to show, and I think that's lacking right now in the literature, is that the use of these identical technologies across firms could be very different. Some could be used in one division, and in other firms, the technology might be mainly collected, gathered in another division. And then if we see this different utilization in the data, the question becomes, why is that the case? And then we could go back into the organizational hierarchies of these firms, try to see if these firms are more layered in terms of decision-making structure or not. And I think there will be eventually a correlation. Whether one can observe that is a question. A second, maybe a different sort of question might be related to whether the same technology is always utilized to replace high skill versus low skill tasks or workers. Or prediction is that even when you have the same technology, and the technology is at identical costs to you, in some cases you might allocate that technology to, again, these divisions that are facing more changing conditions or more uncertain. These might be divisions that you need higher degrees of reasoning and judgment type of tasks to be able to function in that particular division. So in this case, we expect that sometimes you will find the technology more heavily concentrated in these particular more uncertain divisions that might actually house more of the high skill tasks. And I think this should be very easy for an empirical researcher to be able to test for, if you have data inside the organization, to be able to see which divisions actually house the machine or utilize AI. And any information about their sort of the displacement of labor, or what kind of labor they stopped hiring perhaps after using this technology, that might be also very interesting to see. But I think in general, an overall sort of call for research here might be, we don't necessarily know how these technologies, we know that a firm has adopted the technology, and this is because of the lack of data, but we don't necessarily know how that particular technology is used within the firm or across different divisions, and that heterogeneity. And we don't have good ideas for that heterogeneity. And this is, I think, an area for research that could be very, very interesting and very productive.
Great, sounds good. Lots to think about. Christian mentioned he had a question as well.
Yeah, thanks, Pinar. I think this is a super interesting paper. So one of the results that sort of struck me most is the sort of what you said about the optimal organizational form and sort of this interplay between automation and then deciding on what the optimal structure is. And so relating this back to sort of the initial discussion that we had about the definition of automation. I was wondering, so to me, it's and maybe you can correct me if I'm completely off here, but to me, it's sort of what you have in mind for automation is kind of like always on the process side. If you were to think about automation in a sense that it can do tasks that have previously not existed, and sort of extending the market, and sort of think of it more as a product innovation enabling technology, how would your implications for the optimal organizational form change?
That's a great question, and actually that's something that I wanted to highlight, that perhaps surprisingly, the findings that we have, that the effects of automation sort of trickle up to higher levels of management or higher level workers. And this doesn't necessarily have to come from a technology that's geared at their task, right? In this case, we're talking about very low level automation that simply is replacing tasks at the bottom of the organization. even then, even when you start replacing those very low level tasks, you should expect to see some changes that are happening at the higher level, simply because that changes the nature of the responsibility that the mid-level manager has. And that was something that we wanted to highlight. In our case, what we wanted to do was to have a very uncontroversial definition of automation, very simple, and I think something that most people can agree. Automation can have benefits and efficiency, and that's actually something that we don't assume. Right? We don't assume it might be more efficient or less efficient than human workers. It's not assumed in our framework, but it can have efficiency benefits. But what it does is simply reduce the sort of the inconsistency in the production or inconsistency in any kind of work. To the extent that we have a complementary human work complementary technology that again serves the same purposes, we should be able to see the same effects. So what might happen that's different than this context? Maybe there are technologies that make the principle a lot better, right, in terms of getting information. And in that case, of course, the principle would not rely on the mid-level manager as much. So that would be, again, reinforcing the power, the authority at the top, reducing the reliance on the mid-level manager. And there are such technologies, AI technologies, decision-making technologies, and so on. That's different than what we are thinking about. But at least it should map qualitatively to the same sort of result, that organizations would be more centralized. If there's a mid-level technology that somehow makes let's say we didn't model this, but let's say the information of the mid-level manager was somewhat noisy too. And somehow the technology that is introduced is actually making the mid-level manager a lot more precise in the information, and therefore increases the reliance of the maybe high-level principal on the mid-level manager. If there are such technologies that simply serve the mid-level manager and it strengthens his or her position in the organization, then I think that might reverse some of our findings, where because that person is so much stronger or uses information in a more efficient way, then you would want that person in your organization, and you might rely on that person a lot more. In that case, I think that's the only case where we would predict more decentralization and relying on these individuals more, because compared to before, their information is a lot less noisy now. That's something that we haven't modeled, but I think that's also a possibility, a different sort of possibility that can shift the organizational structure in some sense.
Perfect. So we are running out of time. If anybody has one urgent question, they can jump in, but otherwise I'd ask you to maybe email Pinar directly.
Please do. And let me actually put the information here at the end. It's my email. I know that I have there are lots of calculations that go into it, and I have rushed through this a little bit, but if you have additional ideas, questions, comments, please do feel free to reach out to me at this email address, and I'm happy to have a discussion of this online or offline.
Perfect. So thank you very much for being with us today, even in the snowstorm in the Northeast. So we will meet again in 2 weeks' time on March 4th. Our guest will be Feng Shu of Harvard Business School. And thanks all for coming. We had around 100 participants today on Zoom and YouTube together. So we appreciate your participation, and see you again in 2 weeks.